What's up everyone, my name is Mark Hawk and today we're doing a quick side-by-side with the new Gopro Hero4 session running the latest 1.5 update up against the Polaroid Cube. Now we're going to put these cameras through a variety of tests. You can use any of these quick links to jump to the section you're most interested in. Otherwise sit back and we'll start playing them all in just a second. Alright, let's get to it. Now, one thing before we really get started, I've actually gone back and re-recorded this point, but I wanted to point out the Hero4 session, when it seems washed out, it's because it has a much wider range of black levels and white values. Now the Polaroid Cube, if you look at the street light in the center of the screen, you'll notice as it goes behind the white sky, it clips perfectly with the white sky, so it almost becomes invisible. With the Hero4 session, since we have a wider range of values, we're able to separate those sort of background white values, which are much brighter than the white values in the foreground, and we can actually see a defined edge there. So when you see the Hero4 session and it's a little washed out, this could be one of the reasons, is just because it has a wider range of black and white values. We're going to start off by taking a look at what each of these cameras does best at 1080p 30 frames a second. Now the reason why we're starting off with 1080p 30 frames a second is one, because that's really all the Polaroid Cube is really capable of. We can do 720p at 30 frames a second, but if we have the ability to do 1080p, might as well get the highest quality possible. Now the GoPro Hero4 session does have a variety of resolutions and frame rate options, but we'll kind of get into that throughout the duration of this video. But right now we're trying to not push the cameras, we're trying to see what their maximum potential is, and we're going to do this across all sort of times of day and sort of scenarios. Now at the start here, we're going to try and focus on things like quality and clarity as opposed to color profile. Throughout the duration of this, we'll see how the cameras differ in terms of color profile, but what we really want to focus on the start is sort of clarity, sort of edges, how we see things on these green leaves, how areas of certain and similar shades of color blend with one another. Because on a lot of these cameras, you'll see a lot of weird compression lines and cube blocking. It's usually from trying to handle various shades of color. And not really having the information it needs when it does its compression. So instead of having a smooth, gradual ramp in colors, we just see this sort of weird, blocky outline. So we want to look out for things like that. On that last shot, I mentioned how we wanted to see how areas of similar shades of color sort of handle out. And take a look at this bush here on the left. Just notice how there's a lot of weird popping and dancing grade on the Polaroid Cube. And on the Hero4 session, we can just see all the individual branches and everything like that. It's not very sharp and crisp, but that information there is sort of ramping into one another, sort of in a rather smooth fashion. And if we look at these hills in the background, you can see with the Hero4 session, it does a pretty good job of taking those areas of color and sort of going into those different shades of color pretty well. The Polaroid Cube is a little more smudgy, and it looks like it's sharp for a second, but again, we have this weird sort of pulsing grain thing happening. And when we zoom into 200% here, you can just see on the right side of your screen how much softer and how much muddier that middle section is. And again, you can just see that pop just sort of pulsing over and over. We'll also want to take a note of how things like the skinny branch lines look and feel. We want to make sure a lot of those edges aren't being eroded in by light sort of wrapping around them. And again, because of compression, losing a lot of our edge detail. Now the Polaroid Cube has a smaller field of view, and this is going to help eliminate some of the sort of extreme lens distortion we'll see on the left side of the screen, but it limits also what's in the frame, such as the CNN building on the right side of the screen on the Hero4 session. Now with the Polaroid Cube, we have a lot more saturation, a lot more contrast compared to the GoPro Hero4 session. So a lot of our edges can appear to be like really nice, sharp, and crisp on the Polaroid Cube, while the Hero4 session might give the impression that it's a little washed out, and it technically is, but from a post perspective standpoint, like we can go in post-production with this footage later and sort of crunch those edges and make them look a little sharper. But things like that car that we just saw driving up the road, all that dancing grain, all that sort of muddiness, that's going to be really hard for us to get rid of. Even if we use like something like a noise degrainer, removing the grain, it will be fine, but we're going to make the image even softer in the process. And then if we were to add like something like more contrast or just bring the black levels down to try and crunch it, we're not going to really retain any sharpness. We'll artificially do it, but we're not actually bringing back any detail. Take a look with the Polaroid Cube, things like the clouds in the distance. Again, that contrast is making those edges really nice and sharp, but a lot of that stuff in the lower left on the Polaroid Cube, it just ends up being like really muddy when we have colors that are very similar, sort of bunched up against one another. It's really like areas where we need a lot of detail, like with branches, grass, rolling hills, and stuff like that. We'll miss a lot of that detail with the Polaroid Cube. Now again, you can see here the difference in the field of view. We're able to see a lot more of the houses on the left with the GoPro Hero4 session, and you can see the lens distortion is slightly there with the Hero4 session, but it's not too bad. So you gotta take that trade-off with the Polaroid Cube as opposed to the GoPro Hero4 session. With the Hero4 session, take a look at the cloud details here though and how much range and sort of wispiness we see. Nothing's really overexposed. Everything is sort of, well, basically everything's not clipping. Nothing's really blown out. With the Polaroid Cube, I just feel like everything's kind of muddy. It's a little more saturated, and again, we do have some nicer edges in areas, but for the most part, it still is a muddy image, and I don't think it's really worth the trade-off to go slightly washed out compared to having that weird sort of area where you should have detail such as branches, leaves, and grass, and it's all really muddy. But the Hero4 session isn't really known for being the sharpest camera on the market either. If we look at that little sort of gazebo thing on the upper left there's actually a logo detail that's missing from both of these cameras. It would actually be where the top of one of the red poles is on the right. There's supposed to be a little rectangular sort of piece of detail that we can see. Now we're swapping back and forth right now from 30 frames a second to 60 frames a second on the Hero4 session. The Polaroid Cube is limited to 30 frames a second. There's no way to really switch it to do anything more outside of 1080p and 720p 30 frames a second. The GoPro Hero4 session is going to give us a range of 60 frames a second, 30 frames a second. We can even do 120 frames a second at 720p. We can do 1440p at 30 frames a second, which we'll get to here in a bit. But every time we sort of mess around with these settings, we do have a slight quality loss. Now, that really shouldn't deter you from going from 30 frames a second to 60 frames a second with the Hero4 session, or even going from 1440 at 30 frames a second. Like I said, there's a slight quality dip, but not really enough that I would deter you from using it. The areas where there's like a big noticeable hit is maybe 120 frames a second, but again, if you're doing action sports and you really want to capture that, that's definitely the way to go. Now, again, we have a ton of fine detail here, and with the Polaroid Cube, we are just switching from one shot to another with the same exact settings. The only thing that's changing is our lighting values here. So you can see basically the difference when we have really nice contrast lighting, similar to sort of golden hour, as opposed to having a really flat gray sky. You can see just having a little bit of sunlight and some interesting shadows can really make a more interesting composition. And the Hero4 session, you know, we're just switching back and forth again from 30 frames a second to 60 frames a second just to see that slight quality dip. Now the Hero4 session again can do 1440p. 1440p allows us to have a little more extra field of view at the top and the bottom. It's almost like we're sort of opening up a window at the top and bottom just a little bit more. So we have more information there, and we still remain we still have that like 1920 sort of width. We just have a taller frame. So if we're doing something in post-production where we can crop that down to 16:9 later, this is a really good way to sort of set your camera up. Let's say we're doing mountain biking and we're going down a trail. This is a really good way to capture everything from the trail all the way up to the sky. So there's very little risk of aiming the camera too far down or too far high. And with the nature we put the Hero4 session into a lot of times, this is a really good feature because we just have the potential of capturing more stuff, and then we have the option of sort of shifting the frame up or down later if we need to in case it was tilted too far down. Again, here we're just sort of swapping between 1080p 30 frames a second, which was sort of our base, and 1440p. There's not a huge difference here. It's more of a difference in lighting that we're seeing, but quality-wise, I wouldn't really deter you from using either 1440 or 1080p. Before we go underwater with the Polaroid Cube, you can see how sensitive the sort of balance is when it changes color, depending on what it's looking at. And when we go underwater, you're going to notice those colors sort of brightly saturate in the blues. The Polaroid Cube generally, when we're out of water, has this sort of kind of muted red tint to it, but again, underwater in just whatever scenario it's in, it's very sensitive to changing its settings because it's pretty much on auto control the entire time. Now the GoPro Hero4 session, you can actually set a lot of these sort of controls up manually. Like if you wanted to set the white balance up, you can go into your phone and connect it through your Wi-Fi to change things like ISO. But if you don't have the phone app and you are using the new 1.5 update, you can actually control a lot of the settings through the Hero4 session itself. So we can actually change like resolution, frame rate, different types of modes. Before that was limited to having the phone, but again with that 1.5 update, there's a lot more functionality now in the Hero4 Silver. And again, we do have some manual control. That way, if we are going to be in a scenario and we know what our setting is going to be like, and we want it to say sort of locked into that, we have that option. When the Hero4 session is on sort of auto control, it does a really good job of balancing out colors. Like this shot here looks really great. It's saturated, it's not too overexposed. I'd argue that the Polaroid Cube is a little too warm in my taste, but really color profile is a preference to everybody. Everybody has their own sort of color profile that they want. But for me, the Hero 4 session just has a kind of more natural, balanced out look, and I kind of prefer that, especially if we want to do something later in post. I think, especially with like things like sunset and golden hour, the Hero 4 session and even the whole Hero 4 line of cameras has always been designed around this sort of time zone. Now, to be fair, golden hour only lasts about like 45 minutes, an hour and 15 minutes with really interesting shadows, so it's maybe kind of disingenuous to kind of base your whole color profile around that. And I'm not saying that's what GoPro Hero 4 session is doing, it's just that's where it sort of exceeds. So we spin around the car on the Polaroid Cube, look at things like the roof rack here. We have really nice sharp edges. The Hero 4 session always feels like it's just a tad bit out of focus. Like it feels like it's retaining a lot of information in these bushes, it's not doing anything weird. But we look at the Polaroid Cube and we look at things like the ridge line in the distance, the clouds in the distance, all of it just seems more defined in terms of edge quality detail. Now we're going to do an audio test here, and I'll chime back in a second. Alright, the Polaroid Cube Plus and the GoPro Hero session are recording at 1440p, 30 frames a second, while the Polaroid Cube here is recording at 1080p, 30 frames a second. Alright, the Polaroid Cube Plus and the GoPro Hero session are recording at 1440p, 30 frames a second, while the Polaroid Cube here is recording at 1080p, 30 frames a second. The GoPro Hero 4 is using a new dual mic system, and you can actually hear it when I clap. It adjusts to basically, if it hears an audio source that's too loud, it'll switch to the opposite microphone. That way it's all balanced out. So if we have things with a lot of wind noise on the front microphone, it'll switch to the back microphone. And you'll notice with the Polaroid Cube, everything sounded really scratchy and harsh. Now, keep in mind the Hero 4 session is a fully submersible waterproof device. So we're basically in a waterproof housing the entire time, so things in theory are a little muffled, but I think for being in a waterproof case, the Hero 4 session does a really great job. Now I didn't mention it earlier, but the Polaroid Cube is not waterproof out of the box. It needs a separate waterproof housing, which is around, I think, $25 if you wanted to buy it online. But the Hero 4 session right out of the box with no additional housing can be dumped into the water up to 15 feet and can go a lot further than that. So again, we want to focus things on like shrub detail, we want to see the clarity in the branches, we want to see if a lot of that individual information is coming through. Like on the left side, the Hero 4 session, on the left side of the screen, I feel like a lot of those branches are doing a really good job of like cutting off those edges and fading into the highway behind it, while I felt like the Polaroid Cube, again, it's super muddy and it kind of has a hard time blending a lot of those edges with one another, even though the Polaroid Cube does a really good job of defining edges such as like this roof rack here. We just feel it's like really nice and crisp, while the Hero 4 session, even if I were to bump up the contrast a little bit, it doesn't really help, because I was actually doing that a lot with the sort of motion shot that goes around the car. You'll notice in the titles it'll change from contrast to not contrast. It doesn't really help bring back any of that sort of edge detail like we kind of mentioned experimenting with before. Hero 4 session is also really doing a really good job of not contrasting out all of the blacks. So if before we went to 100% here, if you looked at the shrubs on the left side of the screen, it had a nice even array of blacks, while the Polaroid Cube was sort of being very crunchy in the areas where it crunches down those blacks. And again, things like the sky here with the Polaroid Cube, we're kind of crunching down the white values a little much. It's kind of getting very bloomy and overexposed, but it is getting into a lower light condition, so we're trying to get as much information out of this as possible. You can see on the Polaroid Cube, we have a much brighter image now that the sun is completely set. And again, look at things like those edge detail. Again, I feel like the Hero 4 session is much softer, but when we're looking at branches really close to the screen, watch as cars go behind it and just sort of see how with the Polaroid Cube, there is this sort of weird sort of moment where when things pass by another object and it's trying to do that edge detail, it can be a little wonky at points. But again, we're talking about the difference between the Polaroid Cube, which retails for $100, versus the GoPro Hero 4 session, which retails for $299. And again, that price cut came later on in 2015. It did launch at $400, but it dropped down to $299 around the same time it did the 1.5 firmware update and then a lot more functionality. So here we're working in completely nighttime settings. Both of these cameras will do an okay job provided there's some sort of surrounding light, but we have a really small image sensor that we have to work with in both of these cameras, so they're both going to struggle to get a lot of good results in low light. Now the Hero 4 session just has a ton of sort of giant dancing grain information, like things like the CNN building in the back left there, the street lights. A lot of that information is just very muddy and gross. The GoPro Hero4 session is using a 8 megapixel image sensor with a resolution of 3264 by 2448. It's a 4:3 image sensor, and we have a lot of options with photos. Not as much as the Hero4 Silver, so we have like time-lapse options that will take full resolution photos like we see here. We can do different type of ISO values and stuff like that. Polaroid Cube is taking photos with a 6 megapixel image sensor at a resolution of 3328 by 1872. It's a 16:9 image, and it takes photos at a pretty nice quality, especially compared to its video quality. Again, good range of colors, good range of quality all around. But again, it's just the Hero4 session, when it's doing these 4:3 photos, they look way better than its still photography. In the Polaroid Cube, when we're taking it, especially when we're in low light photos, the grain can be just really weird. It doesn't try and keep the shutter open longer. It just kind of boosts the ISO a little bit, and it kind of emphasizes or magnifies a lot of those issues. You can check out these photos for yourself using the link in the more information section below this video, and if you found this video outside of YouTube, check out markhawkcam.com or markhawkcam on YouTube for that link. Anyway, before you go, let me know what you thought of these two cameras in the comments section below, and be sure to like and subscribe. It helps me out immensely, and if you're feeling super generous, head on over to my Patreon page and donate a few bucks to me. That all goes back into markhawkcam.com. If you're not familiar, Patreon is a way you can support YouTube creators, and a lot of what you see in Mark Hawk Cam is paid out of my pocket. Anyway, I'm Mark Hawk. I'll see you out there. Have a good one, everyone.